Hi, I'm Vince from Datum Cycles. In this video, we will discuss how different kinematics, chocks, and settings can transform your riding experience. And since bikes are ridden in the real world, we'll see how you can use this information outside an R&D lab to set and reach goals in regards to your bike behavior. Before diving into it, I will briefly introduce Datum's bike setup software and go over the metrics that we use to compare different setups. So what's Datum? Datum is a web dashboard that enables its user to drive bike setup decisions with accurate data rather than rules of thumb. Our goal is to use data to make bike setup simpler, not more complex. Uses go from simple things like setting sag, saddle height, and cockpit to making practical pressure change or exploring much more complex problems. It all begins with us precisely measuring components, suspensions, and frames. We then feed our database with the acquired data so our algorithms can later use it to build advanced simulation models. But trust me, you don't want to hear about that. When a rider subscribes, we ask key body measurements such as weight, height, and arm span to be able to adequately model and position the rider on the bikes he will build. How it works is really simple. Build your bike and set it up. To see how it goes, let's build a stock 2019 Santa Cruz Megatower. Bikes are built on the left side of the dashboard in the setup panel. As you can see, it's very easy to build a bike with the filtering selection. Once a component is selected, you will be able to adjust its settings. Also, settings like saddle position, cockpit setup, offset bushing, or custom headset are also available. Additionally, in this panel you can load, save, duplicate, or clear setups. You can do funky things like installing a downhill fork on a trail bike or setting up your own mullet bike, but in the end you are responsible to check compatibility. Once the user completes the setup, we're ready to launch a simulation. A numerical model of the rider and its bike is instantly built to extract metrics that describe more accurately than ever how a bike's ride. Our software captures things that change the bike behavior where conventional metrics don't. Every bike can be set in an endless number of ways. It's a great thing because we are all different, but it's important to consider this when we evaluate them. Our geometry charts are a drastic departure from conventional frame charts. We provide geometry of the bike, its components and settings, with the rider on it or at sag. That means that if you change your fork travel, saddle height, sag, or even wheel size, these changes are reflected in our charts. When you think about it, it's really how it should be. Static charts will never be accurate. As for suspension, this chart provides you wheel rate. That's really what you feel from your suspension. A higher number means stiffer or harder to compress, while a lower number means it's softer or easier to compress. These values are normalized with weight distribution. That means that you can compare them with no regards to rider weight. For those interested, the units are newtons per millimeters divided by rider weight in newtons on that end of the bike. This number is then multiplied by 100 so we don't have to look at small decimals number. The curves are aligned at sag so it's easy to see whether you are in your positive or negative travel and have a consistent reference between front and rear and different setups. You can also see G-force markers were added so you can get an idea of the rate and travel usage for a given event. Those are also convenient to evaluate front and rear balance. The 2G tag for the fork being at a lower travel indicate that the bike is slightly pitching rearward in berms and while pumping. It needs to be like this for the front end to cope with the forward weight transfer that are much bigger than the rearwards one. Let's move on to the next part of the video and I'll add information as we go along. Now we're going to do 3 experiments with the Megatower and Super Deluxe at 30% sag as our reference. First, we will compare 2 different frames with the same shock. Then, for the same bike and shock, we're going to look at how you can transform your bike by altering its spring settings. Finally, keeping sag constant, we'll explore the effect of swapping out shocks. What if we compare the Super Deluxe in different frames? The Megatower versus the Transition Patrol. Once you've built a setup and saved it, it's easy to retrieve it to test things out. Obviously, the Patrol shock is the trunnion mount version of the Super Deluxe, but the air spring characteristics are very close. The Patrol gets rid of the travel limiter the Megatower used that take the volume of around 2 tokens. We'll leave geometry for another time, but if you look at it closely, you will see that once you account for setup, which is unique to every rider, The difference between the bike geometry are not what they seem to be looking at the manufacturer's charts. Looking at the suspension chart, we see that the initial wheel rate is lower on the Megatower. In fact, at 3.4, it's more than 30% lower than the Patrol. We're not having extremes here. As a reference, values ranging from 1 to 10 are entirely possible. The hump you see at the beginning of the stroke is caused by the countermeasure spring. Any spring engaging or disengaging will make the rate discontinuous. But don't panic, the variation here is not big enough to be annoying. Firmness at sag at 1.1 and 1.3 is a meaningful difference, but both are quite plush. Most people wouldn't want to go much below that. A usable range would be from around 1 to 3 for a very plush to very supportive feel for gravity-oriented setups. Firmness progression is not as pronounced on the Patrol, but that's neither good or bad. How much you need really depends on the rider and terrain. For both bikes, bottom-out resistance is acceptable for many, but neither offer enough progression for aggressive riding on steep and rugged terrain. To add bottom-out resistance, you either need to raise wheel rate or extend the amount of travel for the same wheel rate, both having their drawbacks. Now I'll introduce you to another useful metric, bump wheel rate. It's the same as wheel rate, but compliance is recalculated for a given bump height. This way, the effect of the wheel path on suspension compliance is captured. The principle here is that for a given wheel rate, the more a bump force is aligned with the wheel path, the softer it will feel. We can see here that the Megatower gets increasingly firmer than the Patrol despite the bigger wheel, which are accounted for. It's not out of the ordinary, but tells us that square edge hit deeper in the travel will be harsher, keeping everything else equal. In our second test, we'll look at how we can change the bike by only altering its settings. We're gonna stick with the Megatower and Super Deluxe and see the difference going from 30 to 25% sag make. That's less than 3 mm on the chuck stroke. Anyone would admit that's hard to achieve reliably, yet it does make a difference. We can see that geometry is affected. It's not huge, but definitely noticeable. In fact, it's similar to what a lot of geometry flip chip do. A 0.5 increase in initial rate and a 0.2 at sag is something many riders will notice. But something's less obvious here. The wheel rate merge together, meaning the rear suspension will feel almost identical for the best part of the positive travel. It's not that the higher air pressure has no effect in that travel region. It does shift up the whole wheel rate, making it harder everywhere, but the thing is that you will never be at the same shock stroke for a given event. Since you have less sag, the curve shifts to the right, giving you more positive travel and pushing out the progression further from sag. The takeaway here is that firmer suspension doesn't necessarily feel like it as counterintuitive as it seems. There is more bottom-out resistance at 4G, good for a lot of riders, but still not enough for some terrains and riders. Let's see how we can increase it with our 30% sag pressure but adding 4.5 tokens. Keep in mind volume spacers don't always have the same effect. For example, in this shock size, a Fox DPX2 without volume spacers offer a progression close to a Super Deluxe with 4.5 tokens. This might explain why maximum volume spacers for Deluxe and Super Deluxe product family went from 3 when it launched to 4.5 and then 5.5 for some configurations. 4.4G is good gains without much impact on small bump compliance, but a much firmer feel later in the stroke. A higher firmness here can give some riders more feedback than they'd like. Notice that even the early part of the curve changed, giving less sag and more support. It becomes clear that using data rather than trial and error makes it easier and faster to work on bike performance. For the last part of the video, we will compare different shocks. First, our baseline Super Deluxe and a Super Deluxe with a Meg air can. Notice how these two shocks need different pressure to achieve 30% sag. It's important to never assume you need to run the same settings like pressure or volume spacer in different products. That can lead to opinions based on poorly set up products. At a wheel rate of 1.5 at sag, the Meg air can bring as much support as the standard Super Deluxe set at 25% sag. It also decreases initial wheel rate quite a bit. That can be great if you are ready to give up a little bit of pop for increased traction and comfort. The ability to tune the negative air chamber with token will add to the complexity of setting up the chuck, but definitely give control to the user. Keep in mind the difference between these two chucks will not be the same in different bikes. Obviously the direction of change will be the same, but how much effect it will have depends. The next shock on the list is the Fox Float X2. Let's see how it fares out. Besides slight differences in sensitivity and support, the Float X2 is surprisingly similar to the Super Deluxe one set at 30% sag. The most interesting thing on this graph comes from the shock bumper, which is quite uncommon in airshock. This bumper was added by Fox in 2019, most probably due to lack of progression. It's not possible to have a smooth transition here, since there is effectively a collision occurring when the shock hit the bumper. Bumpers can provide a lot of ramp in a short distance, which can be very good when something very bad happens. The downside to it is that they generally limit travel, as there is no bumper that will compress down completely. With this shock, the cavity that holds the bumper is a little bit more than 5 mm tall at full travel. That means that the shock bottoms out before the bumper does, so it's possible to reach full travel. After checking out all these air-sprung Megatower setup, let's install a Fox DHX2 to see if it resembles anything we saw today. Since Coil shock doesn't have their spring rate infinitely adjustable like air shock, we were lucky enough to find a coil that gave us our 30% sag with minimal preload. The initial wheel rate is much lower than the Super Deluxe, but if you remember, the Megneg and Float X2 were around halfway in between. However, Coil shock still dominates on that front. Having a sensitive initial part of the travel provides a much smoother ride when the wheel extends between bumps and holes and then smash an obstacle. The downside to it is that some rider on smoother terrain will find a low initial rate dead feeling and lacking pop or playfulness. The sag firmness of 2 will offer more support than any other setup we looked at today while pumping and cornering. Support is really talked about these days, but having more for pumping also makes the suspension less compliant under bump. Again, it's all trade-off and the goal is to end up with a setup that suits each individual rider. I guess you recognize the bumper effect at the end of the curve. This bumper is much shorter and harder than the one found in the Float X2. It also needs to be completely compressed in order to reach full travel, which is not gonna happen. In this particular frame and shock configuration, most riders will never use the last 10 mm of travel. The bumper found on the Super Deluxe coil is taller and softer but will have a similar travel limiting effect. However, it will offer a smoother transition. On that subject, something people usually say about coil suspension is that they lack bottom-out resistance. In fact, this coil setup has a much higher ultimate bottom-out resistance than our baseline setup, but it's just not a useful metric to look at here. It's more about how you get there than how much bottom-out resistance you have. For example, if you lower your coil spring rate and end up with a setup that engages the bumper at 2G, you will still have a higher bottom-out resistance than the Super Deluxe, but all the time you spend in that zone will provide a very harsh ride. So that's it for this video. Thanks for listening. I hope we could demonstrate that in order to get a great riding experience, setup is really important and that data can make things much easier. Imagine jumping on a new bike and instantly knowing how to set it up to feel like home. Or as a racer or engineer, being able to test different setups, knowing exactly what's the difference between them. Feel free to leave comments and feedback, and if you want to learn more about what we do, check out our website at datumcycles.com.